She learned about human mating rituals, then asked me to be her first partner. The thing about Zyra was that she took notes on everything. Not quietly, the way most people do in their heads, or on a private tablet tucked into a pocket. Zyra took notes openly, conspicuously, with the particular focus of someone who had decided that nothing in the universe should go unrecorded. She sat across from Callum Drake in the shared workspace of Research Station Carvel every morning, and before she had even finished her first flask of mineral-neutral water, she had already opened her field journal and written at least 3 observations about whatever she'd witnessed in the common corridor that morning. It had been 3 weeks since she'd arrived. Callum had been on Carvel for 11 months. He was a xenolinguistics specialist, officially, an embedded cultural documentation officer, which meant the Interstellar Research Consortium paid him to observe and record the communication patterns of non-human species who came through the station, whether as researchers, diplomatic guests, or the occasional exchange scholar on an academic rotation. In practice, it meant he spent most of his days doing precisely what Zyra was doing to him, watching, listening, writing things down. It was, he had to admit, a little disorienting to be on the other end of it. "You're doing it again," he said, not looking up from his own screen. Zyra's pen, she used an actual pen, ink-tipped, brought from her home world in a lacquered case, paused. "Documenting. Documenting me. A beat." "Yes." He did look up then. She met his gaze with the particular quality of attention that he'd noticed in her from the first day. Direct, unashamed, curious in a way that wasn't rude so much as simply unfiltered. Her eyes were a deep amber ringed with a thin line of gold striking against the pale silver gray of her skin, which caught the station's overhead lighting and gave her face a faint luminescent quality, like paper held up to a lamp. She was Velhari, which meant she was roughly humanoid in structure but distinctly, elegantly not human in the details. Those eyes, that skin tone, the fine ridges that traced her cheekbones and disappeared into silver-white hair worn loose to her shoulders. She was also, Callum had gathered, one of the most formally credentialed xenosocial researchers in the Velhari Academic Compact, which made the taking notes thing somewhat ironic, given that it was precisely the sort of thing she was studying. "You find it uncomfortable," she said. It wasn't a question, she was writing again. "Not uncomfortable," he said, "just notable." "Noted," she said, and he saw the faintest curve at the edge of her mouth. That was another thing about Zyra. She had a dry sense of humor that she deployed with perfect timing and zero announcement. He turned back to his screen. Across the workspace, the environmental systems hummed, and somewhere down the corridor, 2 Varathi researchers were having what sounded like a debate about mineral calibration. Normal Carvel morning. 3 minutes later, she said, "Callum." "Yes." "Can I ask you something about humans?" He saved his document. This had become a recurring feature of the last 3 weeks, and he had found he didn't mind it. Her questions were never what he expected. "Go ahead." She tapped the tip of her pen against her journal page, considering. He had learned, not nervous. "Your species has a concept called dating." He blinked. "We do. I've been reading about it. I've read 7 texts so far, 3 academic, 2 popular format, 1 first-person memoir account, and 1 which I believe was intended to be humorous, but was actually quite informative." "What was the humorous one?" "A guide titled Everything You're Doing Wrong and Why You're Still Alone. It was recommended in the station library under Human Social Science." Callum closed his eyes briefly. "That's in the library." Under general circulation, it had 17 reader annotations. She paused. 7 of them were from humans. The others were from species attempting to understand human behavior. What did the non-humans think? Confused, primarily. 1 Varathi researcher annotated the phrase, "playing hard to get with. Why would you pretend to have less interest than you feel?" This seems to result only in mutual uncertainty and delayed outcomes. I wrote beside it, this appears to be the point. Callum laughed, not a polite laugh, a real one, sudden enough to surprise him. Zyra watched him with that focused amber attention. What does it feel like when you laugh like that? She asked. The involuntary kind. Like something released a small amount of pressure, he said. Why? She made a note. I've seen you laugh before. The social reciprocal kind. In meetings it looks different. This one looked real. The social reciprocal kind is real too. But differently real. He considered. Yes, differently real. She nodded, satisfied, and returned to her original thread. The concept of dating is interesting to me because it appears to be simultaneously a formal social ritual and a deeply informal one, depending on context. My reading suggests that the rules change depending on culture, subculture, age cohort, technological era, and the individuals involved. Is that accurate? More or less. The constant appears to be, two people decide to evaluate each other as potential partners through a series of shared activities and conversations. The evaluation is mutual and transparent. The social contract is that neither party is under obligation yet, but both are aware that they are being assessed and are assessing in return. He thought about it. That's a more precise description than most humans would come up with. She made a small, pleased sound, not quite a hum, something lower. The complication that I keep encountering is what the literature calls signals. Humans appear to communicate romantic interest through indirect means as often as direct ones. Sustained eye contact, physical proximity, what one text called plausibly deniable touching. That is a phrase that exists, yes. Why plausibly deniable? Callum turned his chair to face her more fully. This was one of those questions that sounded simple and wasn't. Because expressing interest directly is exposing. If you say I am interested in you romantically and the other person doesn't share that interest, it's awkward. It can change the dynamic of a relationship. So people test the ground first. They do small things that could mean something or nothing, and they wait to see how the other person responds. It gives everyone an exit. Zyra was quiet for a moment. Her pen moved. So the indirectness is a function of protecting both parties from the discomfort of an unreciprocated statement. Essentially. But it also means that both parties may be signaling at each other for a very long time without either one being certain what the other means. And the outcome, a clear understanding, is actually delayed rather than advanced by the indirectness. Yes, that seems inefficient. It is. But humans prefer it. A lot of them, yes. She studied him with that direct amber gaze. Do you? He met it, not especially. She wrote something, closed her journal over her pen and folded her hands on top of it. The gesture had a finished quality to it, not the end of curiosity, but the end of a particular thread. Thank you, she said. That was useful. Any time, he said and meant it. The next morning she was waiting with her journal, already open when he arrived. She had, it turned out, questions about gift-giving. Specifically, the phenomenon of bringing someone flowers, which she had read about in 4 separate texts and which had generated in her a particular quality of puzzled fascination. The flower is dead or dying at the point of giving, she said, and yet it communicates what exactly? Life, color. The fact that you thought of the person while near a plant. It's more about the gesture of selecting something beautiful and giving it to someone. The thing itself is a vehicle for the care of choosing it. But it dies. Yes. The gift becomes a visible record of its own impermanence. He paused. I've never thought of it that way. Is that good or bad? I think it might be both. Watching something beautiful fade it has its own kind of significance. Some humans find that meaningful. She tilted her head. On Velhari, he had learned, this meant genuine consideration rather than doubt. You keep the flower as it fades, to mark that someone thought enough to give it to you at all. Sometimes. She made a note, then, what do you find meaningful? As a gift. Callum thought about this seriously. Specific things, he said. Something that shows the other person was paying attention. Not just I got you a present, but I got you this particular thing because I noticed something about you. Specificity as evidence of attention. Yes. She wrote that down and underlined it. He watched her pen move and found himself cataloging things about her the way he cataloged linguistic patterns in his work, not deliberately, but the way the eye returns to whatever it finds interesting. The line of her jaw, the careful way she held her pen, the fact that she wrote in both Velhari script and her own brand of compact, standard shorthand on the same page, as though her thoughts moved faster than one language could contain them. "What are you thinking about?" she asked without looking up. "The way you take notes," he said. "You mix languages. The concepts aren't always equivalent. Some things exist in Velhari that don't have a compact standard match, and vice versa. Using both allows me to be more precise." "What kinds of things exist in Velhari that don't translate?" She considered. "There's a word, verity, for the specific quality of attention someone gives you when they're more interested in you than they're letting on. Not quite watchfulness, not quite care, the awareness of a thing before you've named it." He was quiet for a beat. "There's no compact standard equivalent for that. The closest is fondness, which is too soft, or scrutiny, which is too clinical." She met his eyes. "Neither quite fits." "No," he agreed, "neither quite fits." By the end of the second week, the other researchers at Station Carvel had started noticing. Petra Voss, the station's ecological survey lead and Callum's closest friend at Carvel, raised the subject over lunch with the particular tone of someone who thought they were being subtle. "You and the Velhari researcher," she said, stabbing at her meal. "You're together every morning. We work in the same workspace. You don't usually talk to anyone in the mornings. You're famously unbothered in the mornings. She asks interesting questions." Petra's fork paused. "What kind of interesting?" "About human behavior. She's a xenosocial researcher, it's her field. She's been reading about human customs, and she uses me as a clarifying resource." "What customs?" "Dating, gift-giving. Yesterday, the social function of shared meals." He paused. "Also a fairly extended discussion of hand-holding, specifically why humans do it in contexts that have nothing to do with preventing a person from getting lost." Petra put her fork down entirely. "Callum." "What?" "She's asking you about human courtship rituals. She's asking me about human social customs broadly, including dating, gift-giving, shared meals, hand-holding." Petra spread her hands. "Those are not broad customs. Those are specifically the things humans do when they like someone." He opened his mouth, closed it. "She's a researcher. She's documenting." "Is she documenting the station environmental systems, the Varathi mineral protocols, the logistics scheduling?" Silence. "Or is she asking you, specifically, about the rituals humans use when they're interested in each other?" Callum looked at his tray. He was aware, with some precision, that Petra was describing something he had already noticed and had been carefully not examining too closely. The specificity of Zaira's questions. The way she watched him when she thought he wasn't looking, not the detached observation of a researcher cataloging data, but something with a quality of intention he didn't quite have a word for. Verity asterisk something in his mind offered, unhelpfully. "She might just be thorough," he said. Petra picked up her fork again. "Or she's finding the most efficient path to understanding something. She's decided she wants to understand." He thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. On the third week's Thursday, Zaira was not in the workspace when he arrived. She came in an hour later with her journal already full of fresh notes and a slightly distracted quality that he had come to recognize as post-intensive reading mode. She sat down, opened to a new page, and then did not immediately pick up her pen, which was unusual. He waited. "I've been reading about physical proximity as a marker of social bonding," she said, finally. "I heard." She blinked. "From whom?" "From no one. You told me 3 days ago you were moving into proximity studies." She relaxed slightly. "Yes. I've been reading about touch, what kinds of touch mean what in human contexts, and how humans communicate through physical contact in ways that go beyond functional purpose." She set her pen down on the open journal page. "I have a question." "All right. It's a more personal question than the ones I've asked before." He put his work aside. "All right," he said again. Her amber eyes were steady. Whatever she was about to say, she had clearly decided to say it before she came through the door. "I've been studying human courtship customs for 3 weeks now," she said. "My original intent was academic, to understand a set of social behaviors I had limited reference for prior to beginning a more extended research residency on Earth." A pause. "That remains true. But I've found that my interest in the subject has become less abstract." Callum didn't say anything. "I'm aware," she continued, with the focused precision of someone choosing each word carefully, "that I've been asking you specifically about these things. I told myself the first week that this was because you were the most accessible and most articulate human resource at Carvel. That is true, but it is not the only reason." The workspace was quiet. Somewhere beyond the walls, the station systems moved, the ventilation cycled, the distant conversations of other researchers continued. None of it was particularly loud. "You're an unusually precise person," Zyra said, "in how you think and how you explain things. You don't simplify what you're saying for me, which most people do when they're talking to someone from another species. You engage with the actual complexity of the thing. You laugh at unexpected moments, and it looks like it surprises you too." She picked up her pen, then set it down again, not to write, just for something to do with her hands, which he understood as the Velhari equivalent of a tell. "I've noticed that I plan the questions I want to ask you. I think of things in the course of a day, and I think, I'll ask Callum. That is a different quality of interest from documentation." He was quiet for a long moment, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he wanted to say it right. "Zyra," he said. "Yes. Are you asking me something?" She was still for a beat. "Then, the literature I've read suggests that direct statements of interest are exposing, that most humans prefer the indirect method for exactly the reasons you described: plausible deniability, mutual protection from the awkwardness of an unreciprocated statement." She held his gaze. "I'm not very good at indirect." "I know. The Velhari preference is for clarity. We find sustained ambiguity uncomfortable in most social contexts." A pause. "I understand if the directness is, if it doesn't suit you, or if the answer is no, that's—" "Zyra. Genuinely fine, I'm not." "Zyra." She stopped. "I was thinking about you yesterday," he said, "in the middle of a documentation session, and the thought I had was not professional." He watched her process that. "That's not nothing for me. I'm usually very focused during work." The pen was still in her hand. She had stopped even the notch writing fidgeting, and she was looking at him with the full quality of that amber attention. "That's not nothing for me either," she said quietly. He leaned back in his chair, which was not because he was pulling away from the conversation, but because he needed slightly more air. "What exactly are you asking me? I want to understand the actual question." She took a breath, slow, deliberate, the Velhari respiratory calm gesture he'd learned to recognize. "I would like to know what it's like," she said. "Not in a research sense. In a personal sense. I've read about human courtship and human partnership. I've read about the ways humans mark the beginning of something. I've read about what it means to be someone's first choice for a brief pause, all of it, the whole shape of it. I would like to experience it rather than read about it. And I would like, she said, for it to be with you, if you are willing. The room was very quiet. Callum looked at her, at the careful steadiness of her posture, which was not really steadiness at all but its practiced approximation, the thing you did when you were nervous and had decided to proceed anyway. He thought about 3 weeks of morning conversations. The way she said his name when she had a new question. The word verity and the fact that she had explained it to him and then looked away. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "Is this still research for you? Or has it stopped being research?" She considered this with the honesty he'd come to expect from her. "It began as research," she said. "It is no longer primarily research. I think it became something else approximately 1 week and 3 days ago when you told me the thing about gifts, that the value of a specific gift is that it shows the other person was paying attention." She looked down at her closed journal. "I went back to my room that evening and I thought about the conversation, and I realized I had been paying attention to you for some time, and I hadn't written it in my journal because it didn't feel like data." Callum breathed out slowly. "That distinction feels important," she said. "It is important," he said. "It's actually the most important thing you could have told me." She looked up. "Because I don't want to be a research subject," he said. "But that's not what you just described." "No," she agreed, "it isn't." He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, and she mirrored the angle slightly without seeming to notice. "Here's something that's true," he said. "I told Petra 2 days ago that I find your questions interesting. She pointed out that all your questions have been about things humans do when they like each other, and I said you were probably just being thorough." Zyra's expression did something complicated. "And were you being honest?" "No," he said. "I was being the plausibly deniable version." A long pause. Something shifted in her face, the careful professional composure relaxing into something warmer, more genuine. "You were protecting yourself," she said. "I was, and you just walked in here and did the exact opposite. I told you, I'm not very good at indirect." "I know," he met her eyes. I find that I like it, actually, more than I expected to." The warmth in her face deepened. It was subtle. The Velhari didn't read emotion the same way humans did, broad and shifting, but he'd had 3 weeks to learn her scale, and what he saw now was real. "So what happens next?" she asked. "In the human model?" He smiled at that. In the human model, one of the people in this conversation would ask the other one if they'd like to have dinner. She blinked. "The shared meal ritual." "Yes. You covered that with me last week." "I know, I was thinking about you even then." The pause that followed had a different quality from the ones before, not the silence of uncertainty, the silence of something settling. "I would like to have dinner," Zyra said. "I would like that very much." Dinner at Station Carvel was, practically speaking, a logistical production. The station's common kitchen could be reserved in 2-hour blocks, which was the only real option for anything that qualified as a deliberate meal, rather than a grab tray between work sessions. Callum spent most of Friday afternoon studying the Velhari dietary constraints he'd pulled from the station database: mineral-neutral fluids, a sensitivity to certain Earth-native proteins, a preference for textures that read as solid but yielding in the compact standard dietary notation, and then spent an additional hour staring at the options available in the kitchen inventory, before concluding that the only honest move was to tell Zyra what he was doing and ask her to advise him. Which led to her standing in the kitchen beside him on Friday evening, watching him work, and periodically offering quiet corrections about whether a given spice would read as too sharp against the base flavor profile of what he was making. "This is not how I understood shared meals to work," she observed. Normally, one person prepares the meal and the other arrives to find it finished, he agreed. But I didn't want to make something you couldn't eat. She was quiet for a moment, watching his hands. You looked up my dietary profile. I spent an hour on it. The silence that followed had that quality again, the settled one. She picked up a small herb he'd set aside and examined it. What is this? Time, it's from Earth. I wasn't sure if it was safe for Velhari. The database was ambiguous, so I set it aside. May I? She held out a hand. He gave her the small sprig and she bent close to it, drawing a slow breath. Her expression shifted, not discomfort, something more like careful assessment. It smells complex, slightly resinous, warmer than I expected. Does that mean yes or no? She straightened. I think yes, in a small quantity. She considered him. You were going to leave it out entirely to be safe. Yes. She turned back to the counter and set the time down with a precision that he recognized as a deliberate choice. Put it in, she said. I'd like to know what you'd actually make. He paused. You're sure? You took care to find out what I could eat. Now I want you to make what you wanted to make. She glanced up. Those seem like different things. He looked at her. After a moment, he picked up the thyme and added it to the pan, and the kitchen filled with the particular warm, resinous note of it hitting heat. They ate at a small table near the window, one of the exterior-facing panes that looked out into the dark, the distant light of the system's sun, a small, cold point among the stars. Zaira ate slowly and with concentration, the way he'd noticed she approached most new things, fully present, attending to the experience as it happened. She asked him 3 questions about the meal, what each component was, how it had been prepared, whether this was something he cooked often, and he answered all 3 and found that talking about the food led to talking about where he'd learned to cook, his grandmother, a small apartment, Thursday evenings, and that led to other things, and at some point the careful quality of it, the first dinner awareness of being watched and watching, dissolved into something that was just conversation. She told him about her home city on Velhar, which was built on the edge of a plateau, and had a particular quality of light at sunrise that she had not yet found a match for anywhere else. She told him about her sister, who was 3 years younger and had become a planetary surveyor, and sent communications from places so remote that they sometimes took a week to arrive. She told him about the reason she'd become a xenosocial researcher, an exchange program, age 17, her first time in sustained contact with a species that was not Velhari, and the particular shock of realizing how much of what she'd assumed was universal was actually specific to her world. What did it feel like, he asked, that realization? Like the floor moving, she said, but not unpleasantly, more like discovering the floor was larger than you thought, you had more room than you knew. He thought about that. I had something like it, the first time I documented a language with a grammatical structure I'd never encountered before. I kept trying to map it onto structures I knew, and it kept not fitting, and eventually I had to accept that I needed to approach it as if I knew nothing. Beginner's mind, she said. Yes. Did that feel like loss, giving up what you thought you knew? A little, he said, but mostly it felt like permission to discover. She looked at him across the table, and in the low light of the common kitchen, her eyes caught the glow from outside and held it. Yes, she said, that's it exactly. He walked her back to the residential corridor afterward. The station was quieter at this hour, most of the research staff on night cycle. The lighting shifted to the warmer, lower register that marked the end of the working day. Their footsteps were quiet on the composite flooring. He was aware of the distance between them, not large, not small, the kind of distance that could mean nothing or something depending on what came next. At the door to her room, she stopped and turned to face him. I looked something up this morning, she said, before the kitchen. What? The human gesture at the end of a first shared meal, whether there's a conventional form. She met his eyes. There appears to be. Several conventions, actually, depending on the individuals and the degree of development in the interest. He felt something in his chest that was mostly warmth and partly amusement. There are. The most common appears to be direct physical contact, brief, on the cheek or on the mouth, depending on degree. She said this with clinical precision, and the particular quality of focus she brought to things she was slightly nervous about. My understanding is that the mouth is the more significant one. That's correct. She looked at him steadily. I would prefer the more significant one. If you're willing. He had, at some point in the last few hours, stopped being surprised by her directness and started simply receiving it as the gift it was, the complete absence of performance, the commitment to saying the thing rather than circling it. It was, he thought, one of the most honest forms of courage he'd encountered, this particular willingness to simply state what she wanted and let the other person answer. I'm willing, he said. She leaned up. She was slightly shorter than him, which he hadn't focused on until now, and he met her halfway. And for a moment it was just that. Brief, warm, unhurried, a kind of answer to several weeks of questions. When they separated, she was looking at him with the full quality of that amber attention, and what he saw in it now was different from the researching look and different from the noting-taking look. It was something quieter. That was as she started. Yes, he agreed. The edge of her mouth curved. I was going to say that it was different from what I expected. Better or worse? Different, she said again, and then after a pause, much better. He was smiling and was not attempting to stop. Zaira. Yes. For what it's worth, I've been thinking about this since about day 5. She blinked. Day 5 of my arrival. Day 5. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read, and then something shifted, softened, and she laughed. Not the social laugh, not the documenting a reaction laugh, the real one, low and surprised and genuine, and it turned out that the Velhari version of it sounded like wind across something hollow, and it was the most beautiful thing he'd heard all year. Day 5, she said when she'd collected herself, and you said nothing. I was being indirect, protecting myself. From a plausibly deniable position. Exactly. That, she said, seems extremely inefficient. Extraordinarily, he agreed. She looked at him for another moment, and then she reached out and put her hand briefly on his arm, the light touch of someone making contact for the specific pleasure of making contact, nothing more complicated than that, and said, Good night, Callum. Good night, he said. He walked back to his own corridor with the warm, resinous smell of time still on his hands and the sound of her laugh still in his ears, and he thought that he should probably document this somehow, not professionally but personally, the kind of thing you keep so you can return to it, and then thought, not yet. Let it just be real for a while first. Saturday morning, she was already in the workspace when he arrived. Journal open, pen in hand, the flask of mineral-neutral water to her left half finished, which meant she had been here for some time. He set down his own coffee, pulled out his chair, sat down. She didn't look up immediately, but her pen stopped moving, the tell of awareness. Good morning, he said. Good morning. A pause, she looked up. The direct amber gaze, same as always, but with a new quality layered into it, the quality of something known rather than something being discovered. I have a question. I thought you might. It's about she considered, the morning after convention, for a first shared meal and subsequent contact. I'm not certain what the protocol is. He sipped his coffee. The protocol, he said, is largely whatever the two people involved decide it is. There's no fixed form. She nodded slowly. So it's contextual. Very. And the context here, at a research station, both of us in professional roles, the initial meeting having been partly documentary in nature. Zaira. She stopped. What would you like the protocol to be? He asked. A pause. Her pen moved briefly, as if starting a note and then thinking better of it. She looked at him with that full attention, not gathering data, something more direct than that, and said, "I'd like it to be breakfast, if you haven't eaten." He hadn't. "I know the kitchen inventory," she said. "I learned it last night. There are 4 things that work for both of us without adaptation." You cataloged the kitchen inventory. I found it interesting. The edge of her mouth was doing the thing again. "I'm a researcher." He stood up. "Show me what you found." She closed her journal, capped her pen with the particular neat finality that meant she was done with that thread and ready for the next one, and stood. The workspace around them continued its morning sounds, ventilation, distant voices, the station's ordinary machinery of life, and none of it was particularly dramatic. She walked beside him toward the kitchen, close enough that their arms nearly touched, and told him about the 4 things she'd found. A grain-based porridge that took well to the Velhari mineral blend, a fruit compound that was native to neither of their worlds but tolerated by both, a pressed bread that had no species-specific ingredients, and a nut paste from the Varathi common supply that she suspected would be either very good or entirely wrong but wanted to try. "Let's find out," he said, and she said yes, and they went to find out together. 3 weeks later, Petra Voss stopped Callum in the corridor outside the ecological labs and said, with the expression of someone who had been right and found it vindicating, "I told you." "You did," he agreed. "The courtship rituals question." "Yes." "She was asking you about human courtship rituals because she wanted to know how to court you." "Specifically," Callum said, "she was asking me about human courtship rituals so she could decide whether to apply them, because she was interested in me and wanted to understand what she was potentially getting into before she made a direct statement of intent." He considered, which is, actually, a very thoughtful approach. Petra stared at him. "That's the most romantic thing you've ever said." "She'd probably call it efficient." "I'm going to need to meet her properly," Petra said. "A person who describes falling for someone as applying a research methodology is someone I need to know." Callum thought about Zyra at their table by the window, telling him about the quality of light on the plateau edge of her home city. He thought about the Velhari laugh, low and surprised, and the word verity and the careful way she'd explained it, the awareness of a thing before you've named it. "I'll introduce you," he said. "She'll probably ask you a lot of questions." "That's fine," said Petra. "I have a lot of questions too." He walked back toward the shared workspace, where she would be, and where the morning had not yet run out. The question about music came on Tuesday of the 3rd week, 6 days before the dinner. Zyra arrived in the workspace with her journal already annotated. She had clearly been reading before she came in, which meant she'd found something that sparked a question she wanted to pursue immediately. Callum had learned to recognize this state from the set of her shoulders. Not tense, exactly, but activated, the particular readiness of a mind that had found a thread and wanted to pull it. "Human music as a mating signal," she said, before she was fully seated. He set down his coffee. "Good morning." "Good morning." Human music as a mating signal. That's a broad category. "I know, I've been reading about it since last night." She opened her journal to a page dense with notes in 2 scripts. "The phenomenon I'm most interested in is the practice of sharing music with a person you're interested in, not performing music for them, which has an older courtship function I've already read about, but sending recordings, compiling collections, the contemporary version." "Playlists," he said. "Yes, playlists." She underlined the word in her notes, though she'd clearly already written it. "The function appears to be, here are things I listen to when I'm alone in private moments, and I'm giving you access to that." She looked up. "Is that accurate?" "More or less. You're letting someone see your inner landscape in a way. The things that move you, or that you find useful or comforting, or that match a particular feeling." So it's an act of transparency about internal experience. Yes. And the implicit message is, here is something true about me, and I trust you with it. He held her gaze for a moment. When it's genuine, yes. She made a note. The reason I find this interesting, she said, is that on Velhar we have no equivalent. Music is primarily a communal form. It belongs to a group, a season, an occasion. There is no tradition of private music. The idea that you would accumulate, over years, a set of sounds that belong specifically to your own emotional interior, that is a very individual thing. Humans are fairly individual, Callum said. Yes, it's one of the most consistent things in the literature. The structure of human selfhood is quite separate. You each have a distinct interior that is genuinely your own and not particularly shared even with those you're close to. The music sharing is interesting precisely because it's a breach of that separateness, a deliberately chosen one. He thought about this. You're describing intimacy. She tilted her head. Is that what it is? The deliberate breach of the separateness, he said. The choice to let someone in, that's what intimacy is. Not necessarily physical. It's the decision to let someone have access to something that is ordinarily private. She was quiet for a moment, writing. On Velhar, selfhood is less bounded, she said. We're more, I don't know the compact standard word, permeable perhaps. Our inner experiences are more routinely shared. But that means the things that are private feel more private when they exist. She paused. The experience of having something that you have not shared and then choosing to share it is perhaps rarer for us, but when it happens, it is significant. What kinds of things are private for Velhari? She considered, and he watched something in her expression shift slightly. Not evasion, more like genuine consideration of territory that was less automatically mappable. Doubt, she said finally. We share most things readily, but uncertainty, not about facts but about ourselves, about whether what we're feeling is what we think it is, that we tend to keep close. A pause. And things that are not yet named, things that are still in process. He thought of the word verity again, the awareness of a thing before you've named it, and understood something he hadn't quite understood when she first explained it. That makes sense, he said. She looked at him with that amber attention. Does it? There's something vulnerable about a thing that's still becoming. You don't know yet whether it will turn into what you hope, or into something else, or into nothing. Protecting it makes sense. Yes, she said, quietly with the quality of recognition. That's exactly it. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The workspace did its morning things around them. Somewhere down the corridor, the Varathi researchers were already at it. Callum could hear the particular rhythm of their language through the wall, the complex clicking and tonal variation that he had spent 3 months learning to parse. Do you have a playlist, Zara asked, of that kind, private things? He didn't answer immediately. Yes. What is it like? I've never described it to anyone. She looked at him. Then you don't have to. I know. He found himself reaching for the right words, not because he didn't have them, but because he wanted them to be accurate. It's older things, mostly. Some of them I've had since I was very young. Songs that I listened to at particular moments, and that became associated with how I felt, so that now when I hear them, the feeling comes back regardless of context. He paused. Some of them I can't listen to in company because the feeling they produce is too specific, too internal. Zaira was very still. She was not writing. What does too internal feel like? Like being caught in a private moment, he said. Like someone opening a door you didn't expect. And that's uncomfortable. With most people, yes. In some contexts, no. She looked at him for a moment and he looked back, and the thing that was still in process between them, not yet named, still becoming, was almost palpable in the space between their chairs. Then she nodded once slowly and picked up her pen. I'm going to add a section to my notes, she said. titled The Architecture of Private Experience in Human Romantic Interest Formation. That sounds very academic. I'm an academic, but the edge of her mouth was doing the thing. The day after the kitchen meal, Sunday, she found him in the secondary lab, where he had gone to complete a transcription that required more quiet than the shared workspace generally offered. She knocked at the open door, which was a compact standard courtesy gesture she'd adopted early. He'd noticed that she'd picked up a number of small human social forms without being told them, the way someone picks up a rhythm by listening. "Am I interrupting?" she asked. "No. Come in." She did and stood near the door for a moment, as though calibrating something. She was still in the same clothes as the previous evening, the Velhari worksuit in the deep teal that seemed to be her default, practical in the way that suggested it, was chosen for ease rather than display. Her journal was tucked under her arm. She looked, he thought, like someone who had decided to come somewhere before they'd quite finished deciding what they were going to say when they got there. "I went back to my room last night," she said, "and I wrote in my journal." "What did you write?" "Nothing documentable." She paused. "I've been thinking about what you said, the thing about letting something be real before recording it." He had said that to himself, walking back to his corridor. He hadn't said it to her. "I didn't say that to you," he said. "No," she agreed. "I was thinking the same thing separately." She looked at him with calm attention. "That seems significant, that we arrived at the same thought without being in the same space." He turned his chair to face her fully. "What did you write?" "I wrote about how it felt," she said. "Not the mechanics of it, not the social form or the research context, how it felt specifically to me." A pause. "I don't usually write that. I write about what I observe. The thing observed, the context, the patterns. My own interior experiences. I told you we protect uncertainty." "Yes." "I wrote about uncertainty," she said. "Specifically, the uncertainty of whether what I'm feeling is as significant as it seems, or whether I don't know the word, inflating it. Because it's new, and new things carry more charge than familiar ones, and sometimes that charge is the novelty rather than the thing itself." Callum was quiet for a moment. This was, he thought, probably the most honest thing anyone had said to him about this subject in years. "You're asking whether it's real," he said. "I'm asking whether I can trust the feeling. Can I tell you something?" She waited. "I've had that question," he said. "About this. About you, in the last 3 weeks." He held her gaze. "And the answer I keep coming to is that the charge isn't just novelty, because novelty fades and this hasn't. It gets more specific. More weighted. That's different from the first flush feeling." She absorbed this. "How long has yours been getting more specific?" "Since day 5, he said. "The day you asked me why humans prefer indirect communication to direct statements of interest. You made a face when I explained it, like you found the logic structurally unsatisfying, but were being polite about it." The edge of her mouth. "I was being polite about it." "I know, I found you very," he stopped, looked for the right word. "Real," he said. "You were immediately real to me, which doesn't happen often." She looked at him for a long moment with that full attention. "Real," she repeated. "As opposed to adjacent." Present in the same space without actually meeting. He was not sure he was explaining this well. Sometimes you're in the same room with someone for weeks and you never quite intersect. And sometimes within a day it's like there's no question about whether the intersection is real. "Immediate recognition," she said. "Yes." She was quiet. Then she said, "I wrote something else in my journal last night, after the part about uncertainty." "What?" She set the journal on the nearest surface, a deliberate motion, not opening it, just setting it down so it wasn't between her and anything. "I wrote, I am not frightened by this, which is itself something I want to examine. Novelty usually produces more caution. The fact that it doesn't suggest I trust him, which is a data point about both of us." He held this for a moment. "I'm telling you," she said, "because I told you I'm not good at indirect, and also because," the pause, "the thing that's still in process. I wanted to say it before I lost the specificity of it." "What are you saying?" "I trust you," she said. "That's what I'm saying. I've been here for 3 weeks and I trust you. That isn't usual for me." She held his gaze with the full weight of that amber attention. "I wanted you to know." The secondary lab was very quiet. On the opposite wall, the window showed the same view as all the exterior windows at Carvel: dark, stars, the distant cold sun, and none of it was dramatic in the slightest. And it was also, somehow, the clearest Callum had felt in several months. "I know," he said. "I can tell." A pause. "It goes both ways." She nodded once. Then she picked up her journal, tucked it back under her arm, and said, "I'll let you finish your transcription." "You could stay," he said. "If you want to work, the quiet is good in here." She looked at him, and then she crossed to the secondary desk, pulled out the chair, sat down, and opened her journal to a fresh page. They worked in the same room, in comfortable quiet, for the next 2 hours, and the thing between them was no longer quite so unnamed as it had been. 6 weeks after Zyra's arrival at Station Carvel, the first delivery from the transit dock included a small package addressed to Callum, routed through the station's internal mail. Inside was a slim data chip, the Velhari kind lacquered casing, the deep blue-green of high-quality manufacturing, with a handwritten card tucked beneath it. The card was in compact standard, in her careful, precise handwriting. "This is what I listen to when I am alone. Some of it predates my arrival at Carvel. Some of it I added after. I find I no longer want to keep it separate from things you know about me. Azee." He sat with it for a long moment, in his room, in the quiet of his own private space, holding something small and extraordinarily specific. Then he found his own collection, the one he'd mentioned to her but never opened to anyone, and began to think about what he wanted to add to it. The appropriate response to a gift, his grandmother had always said, was not only thanks but reciprocity. You gave something back that showed you had been equally paying attention, equally willing to be known. He owed her that. He planned to pay it. The station held a monthly common meal, all species, all departments, the long shared table in the main refectory laid with dishes from every culinary tradition represented at Carvel, which in practice meant a sprawling, bewildering, occasionally alarming array of textures and smells and colors. The protocol was informal. You took what looked appealing and left the rest, and no one was offended, because the whole exercise was social rather than gastronomic. Zyra had attended the previous two and sat beside Callum at both, which he had at the time attributed to the practical logic of sitting near a familiar person. Looking back, he recognized this as one of those things that had probably meant something else. The common meal in their third week together fell on a Wednesday, 4 days before the dinner, and arrived at a moment in the space between them that was distinctly different from the previous two. She sat beside him as before, but the distance was different now, slightly closer, by a margin too precise to be accidental. He noticed this the way you notice something you've been half aware of, suddenly fully, all at once. Around them, the table was alive with the particular noise of Carvel at its most socially ambitious. The two Varathi researchers were having a side conversation at high speed and low volume. Petra Voss was 3 seats down, in animated discussion with a Sarathi exchange scholar about something that seemed to involve a great deal of hand gesturing. The station director, a broad and amiable human named Havorson who had been running research posts for 20 years, and had the particular calm of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by anything, presided at the head of the table with an expression of benign contentment. "Is this uncomfortable for you?" Zyra asked, close enough that he could hear her beneath the general noise. "The meal. The number of people, the noise. You tend to work in quiet." He considered. It's an occasional uncomfortable that I find worth it, he said. These people are interesting. It's useful to be in the same room with them. She nodded, pulling a small portion of something from the Varathi section of the table, a grain preparation pressed into clean geometric shapes, one of the few things that translated across most of the Carvel dietary profiles without requiring adaptation. I find, she said, that large social gatherings are more useful when I have a person in them, rather than entering alone. A person. A specific person whose presence makes the context less ambient. She ate one of the pressed grains, considering it. Before Carvel, I found research station common meals somewhat isolating, even when the conversation was good. There was no particular center of gravity. He looked at her sideways, and now. She looked back. Now there is. The noise of the table continued around them, and he felt something warm settle in his chest, not the warm of surprise but the warm of recognition, the feeling of a thing being confirmed that you had already half known. He reached for something from the nearest dish and said, quietly, "Same." She made the small, pleased sound, the one that was not quite a hum, and turned back to the table, and they spent the next hour in the particular comfortable dual mode of people who were separately engaged in the general conversation while remaining, underneath, primarily aware of each other. Halvorsen, walking the length of the table with the relaxed proprietary air of a person who had kept this particular ship running for 3 years, paused near their end and said to Callum, "Dr. Drake, your documentation series on the Varathi click language registers, I read the interim report. Excellent work." Then to Zyra, "And Dr. Velthara, yes, enjoying Carvel." "Very much," Zyra said, with the polished warmth of someone who had long practice in being a visiting researcher. "The interdisciplinary access is exceptional. I've been particularly fortunate in the quality of the colleagues I've been able to consult." Halvorsen nodded, already moving on, the satisfied proprietary nod of a station director whose people were happy and productive, and he could tell. When he was safely down the table, Zyra said, perfectly level, "That was technically accurate." "It was beautifully accurate," Callum said. "I've been told I have a talent for precision." "I've noticed." She tilted her head. "Is that a compliment?" "Yes," he said, genuinely. She was quiet for a moment, and he saw something move through her expression, something that would have been invisible to him 3 weeks ago and was now readable, if only approximately. The quality of being told something true and good and receiving it without deflecting it. "Thank you," she said. The chip arrived, and Callum spent 3 evenings with it before he understood what she'd done. She had organized it chronologically, not by when the pieces had been made, but by when she had encountered them. The earliest tracks were clearly very old, Velhari acoustic music that he had to research to understand, meditative and structured, the kind of thing that accumulated meaning through repetition across a whole society before becoming personal. But the personal ones were visible. You could feel them, the moment in the chronology where the collection became less about the tradition and more about specific moments in a specific life. There was a section 37 minutes in where the mood shifted, less meditative, more searching. He played it at night in his room and understood after a while that this was probably her period of early research trips, the exchange program, the first contact with non-Velhari species, the experience of the floor being larger than she'd known. The music had the quality of something heard at a particular kind of distance, both alien and reaching for connection. And then, 70 minutes in, something changed again. The selections became more varied, Velhari mixed with compact standard musical forms he recognized, and some things he didn't recognize at all, from species he couldn't immediately identify. More adventurous, more interested in the unexpected. He found himself listening to these sections repeatedly, trying to understand what had shifted in her at that point. He didn't ask. It felt like the kind of question that, if it was to be answered, would be answered in its own time. What he did was start building his own response. He had not added to his private collection in over a year. The last additions had been from the early months at Carvel, when the unfamiliarity of the posting had produced a particular quality of feeling, not unhappy, but unsettled, the specific tone of being somewhere new without yet having made it yours. He found those tracks again and listened to them, and they sounded different now, the same pieces, the same feelings, but viewed from a distance that had shifted their meaning. He added them to the front of what he was building for her, the older material, the private interior things, the songs that belonged to specific moments in his life. He added the grandmother's kitchen and Thursday evenings. He added the particular quality of a morning where the language he was studying finally opened up and became navigable, a track he'd had on repeat for days as a kind of accompaniment to the breakthrough, so that now the music and the comprehension were permanently linked. He added 3 pieces that he had never described to anyone, because the feelings they produced were too specific to be general, the things he had meant when he said too internal. He had not planned to do that. He found himself doing it anyway. He put it in a small card and left it on her desk in the workspace on Thursday morning, before she arrived. She was quiet about it for most of the day. He did not press. At the end of the afternoon, when the workspace was nearly empty and the light outside had shifted to the cool dim of station evening, she looked up from her journal and said, "The 3 pieces in the middle, the ones without any context in the timestamp." He looked at her. "Those are the ones you called too internal," she said, not a question. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "I listened to them 3 times. I wanted to understand what they said about you." A pause. "I think I do, a little, or I understand the shape of them, even if not all the content." She held his gaze with full amber attention. "Thank you. You gave me yours first," he said. "That's not why you should thank someone for something like this," she said. "The reciprocity is not the point. She searched for the word. The trust is the point." "Yes," he said, "you're right." She nodded and turned back to her journal and wrote something, and he had a strong feeling he knew what it was. Later he would think that this, the exchange of music, the playlists that were not exactly playlists but were in some sense closer to letters, was the moment when the thing between them had finally been named. Not in language, not in any single direct statement, though there had been one of those, and he would not forget it, but in the older, less efficient, entirely human way, by giving someone access to the private landscape, the interior, the things too specific to be general, and trusting that they would receive them carefully. He had. That seemed, on reflection, like the most important thing.